My name is Dante Lencastre. I'm a documentary filmmaker and activist based in Los Angeles. I'm originally from Peru, and I'm the director and one of the producers of AIDS Diva, The Legend of Connie Norman, which will be showing virtually at the Bend Film Festival.
Great. And I am Jamie Nesbitt. I am president and co-founder of Out Central Oregon, which is a LGBTQ advocacy group here in Central Oregon. We actually have a partnership with Bend Film called Out in Focus, where our mission really with this partnership is to bring queer film to Central Oregon. And we've had this partnership for about a year and a half, and we're very happy to welcome you, Dante, and your film to the 2022 Bend Film Festival. You were being a bit modest. You are actually an award-winning documentary and filmmaker.
Yeah.
And I definitely would like to hear more about some of your films if we have time. But the film that we'll be screening here as part of Bend Film Festival next week, as you mentioned, is basically the story of Connie Norman and her activism in a period of time when AIDS was affecting the US and many government officials were just not paying attention. And I think I just would like to start about what the motivation was for you to put this documentary film together.
We started actually just with the idea of making the documentary about 4 years ago. We had just gotten a new chief in the White House. That was not good news. And somebody tapped me in the back and said to me, "Why don't you make a film about?" I had just premiere my film about a trans teen raising Zoe, of a single mom raising her trans teen here in Downey, California. And as a filmmaker, you always feel like, "Oh, please don't ask me about that particular question," because it takes at least for me 3 or 4 years to make a film. And he said, "Why don't you make a film about my friend Connie Norman?" And I was like, "Who's Connie Norman?" I mean, I had heard the film, I have heard the name in the community because they used to give transgender trailblazing leadership award under her name. And I had seen a poster of her in pink, which is her iconic poster of Connie. And you just see her with her sunglasses and the big afro, and I thought, oh, so she's African American, And most of my films, the 4 films I had made so far, were about either trans Latina women or trans women from Peru, where I'm from. So I said, well, maybe I'll just branch out and start, looking at other ethnicities. And somebody pointed to the One Archives. They have 1 or 2 clips of Connie, and I saw what she was Caucasian. She was from Texas, but it was the things she was saying were just really very moving to me. I mean, they were very pointed, but they were all very timely and resonant. And I just started digging, and I found her friends from ACT UP LA. Some of them very close, who wound up in the film and who had collected throughout her lifetime as an activist footage of her, not only doing demonstrations, but also hanging out in Kauai, which she used to go for her spiritual respite, getting arrested, being in Sacramento in front of of the huge crowds, and doing her talk shows. And I thought, oh my God, I think we hit the jackpot, because we're going to be able to tell the story in her own voice, which is really what's unique about the film. She tells you, and you can see all different facets of Connie until a few months before she passed. When she was, reckoning with her, the little time she had left and what her legacy would be. And I think, well, it's about time somebody tells about that legacy, because her message is still very impactful. And it seems like she's talking about what's going on right now. So That's
No,
the
and
long answer to your
no,
question.
that's fantastic, Duarte, and I will I have a few things to say on that. But yeah, I one of the things that impressed me about the film was this: you had footage from the late '80s and early '90s that we all take for granted now because we have cell phones and we can capture images and videos immediately. But back then, that didn't exist, and so I'm wondering how much of a challenge it was to pull and find this footage, this archived footage, because I think, as you just indicated, it really helped tell the story. You really got a real personal look and feeling of Connie and the struggles and all of it was that, everything that was going on at the time with ACT UP and the movements, but really showed a real personal side of Connie and in her many emotional facets throughout the film.
Well, I think the main blessing was to have Peter Cashman, who was Australian broadcaster, was Connie's best friend, who's in the film, and he filmed her, like I said before, everywhere she went. I mean, he was, I'm not saying obsessed with her, but and he had no idea that someday we will make. And he even told us, I had no idea somebody was going to make a film about her, but he was just totally loved her and just recorded everything that she did. I mean, a lot of people recorded stuff back then, but like, like Peter, when we went to Peter's house, he's a little bit of a hoarder, and he just showed us boxes and boxes of VHS tapes, and he said, you can have anything, and some of them were not labeled, and we said, we'll take in them all, and we digitized almost 40 hours of tapes. And that's one thing for us to know as we get older. If we do have VHS tapes, Super 8, High 8, Beta, we have to digitize them. I
Mhm.
mean, there were some footage that we couldn't use, and we had no idea what was in it because it was already destroyed
How
by
degraded, right?
moisture. So
Mhm.
we also had a luck to find somebody that had done that from LA Cal Arts. There was a group of students who were allowed because there was a privacy issue also with filming, especially the indoor ACT UP LA meetings. As you remember, that time was not like everybody was out and proud, but they were allowed to film the vigil because it was outdoor at USC,
Mhm.
and that was a little more of a challenge to put together because kids were dropping the camera, and because those cameras are bulky, they were not like the ones we had a few years later, the Handycam. That's how I shot my first film. And so that was and also a lot more challenging to digitize and find a way of making it you know acceptable to an audience now. But and also the recollections of all her friends. I mean, anybody who's ever been touched by Connie, either by being next to her or being in a conversation with her or being in an ACT UP meeting with her, always remember her fondly. And not only because she was fearless and fierce, but because she was the first trans person that I ever met. And Connie made sure that at the end of that meeting that you knew what that meant. She will school you.
No, absolutely. I think it's very clear from the interviews, the more recent interviews of Connie's closest friends that you were able to capture within the film. People were speaking extremely warmly and lovingly as they were reminiscing and remembering their experiences with Connie, as well as Connie's continued resilience in the fight for human rights and transgender rights and all of that. But I would love just to give a little, if you could give a little background to the audience of who Connie was and how significant that was as being, and in the film it's referred to as transsexual, but that's a reflection of the time. But as a transgendered woman in the late '80s, and what courage and resilience that must have been for her.
Well, Connie was actually she was born in Ventura County, but her her family was from Texas. So by the time she was 2 or 3, she went back to Texas and she kept that Texas accent until she passed. Um, as she explains in the film, she was sissy and she was teased and bullied and abused. We only know like third party details of that. And she didn't like to talk about that, but she did talk about running away and coming back to LA and, being on the streets as a 14-year-old, doing drugs, doing, survival sex work, and just, you know, being, wild and free and,
And trying to survive essentially as
and
well.
trying to survive as you did when you were that age.
Mhm.
And along the way, like she says in one of her speeches, she felt that, she was a woman, and she went along that path of of getting to that place where her womanhood was her cloth, and I think that throughout her, and I think she only finished like maybe high school, but I think she was really like autodidact. She was like a sponge. Even on the streets, her survival skills, she kept learning from other people that were older than her. She always
Mhm.
looked for mentors like Harry Hay,
Mhm.
you know, and she was ferocious reader. She read about the Sunni woman and the Berdash and the Mahus, and really her gender journey just never stopped evolving, as she talks in the film. And she was part of the radical fairies and gender nonconforming. And I think her biggest lesson was basically, you know, zero converting, being an HIV positive woman and finding a community that way, first finding the community in San Francisco and then coming to LA and finding another community and having the intentional family that a lot of queer people have. And like you said, at the time it was challenging. There was not LGBT back then. It was only L and G,
Mhm.
so she had to be louder. I remember some people say, oh, she was really loud. I said she had to be loud.
Mhm.
Otherwise, she would be invisible. I mean, I know she was physically imposing, but her voice and what she said had the wisdom of all the cultures that she represented when she was in that room. And I think that's what people remember the most, her humanity, her compassion, her empathy, and like I said, her wanderlust for continuing to follow her gender journey.
No, that's fantastic. And all those amazing attributes to Connie really reflected in the film that you made. So viewers will really get a real intimate understanding and look into Connie as a person and the life that she lived through the film. One of the things that I was really loved about the film was um, a lot of footage and a lot of discussion about the early days of ACT UP, when HIV and AIDS was not getting recognized by government agencies at the federal level, but also at the state level. And of course, there was the Pete Wilson when he was governor of California, which I completely forgot about that from when I was younger, and remembering it now after watching the film, which was fantastic. But the whole ACT UP, there was, these were, as the film says, our gay brothers are dying, and our society has just completely ignored them and just is allowing them to die. And it's somewhat painful to watch. I mean, I feel like there's a lot of this, I think, throughout your film. There's a lot of parallels, and you briefly touched on this when you first spoke earlier. A lot of parallels of protests and the struggles that marginalized communities have or had back then, and that we can easily see within the film through the eyes of Connie, but that are reflected really not very differently even today, maybe to different marginalized populations. But I saw so many parallels of what's happening in modern contemporary times, with the protests and individuals, marginalized groups being ignored, essentially, compared to what was going on in the late 80s and early 90s. That's reflected in your film. That for me was probably the biggest impression that the film left on me, in addition to just getting to know and understand Connie's life. Um, I don't know if you could comment a little bit on that.
Yeah, well, I mean, I came out as a gay man in New York, which was at the epicenter of AIDS in actually in 81. And I have to be honest, Jamie, I was petrified of everything. I mean, I remember I had a boyfriend at the time, and we moved in with a couple out of Columbia. I went to Columbia University, and I remember, like not labeling their stuff from our stuff, and I didn't even know their status. I was just like, I mean, actually, my ex-boyfriend was even more paranoid than I was, and one summer, one of them said, I'm going back to home to Texas. And he never came back. I think that
Mhm.
was like summer of '83. Um, and that's what was happening. People were just dropping out. And nobody mentioned gay cancer. They had it even labeled AIDS. And I have to admit that I was not political, even though I was in New York and ACT meetings were, a couple of subway stops away. I did not participate in anything. I was just going on my theatrical career and with my ex, and we were just being with each other and
Mhm.
trying to, like I said in one Q&A, I thought like, oh, we're monogamous. We're not those kind of people. We're not partying. We're not going to bad houses. We're not doing drugs. We should be okay, and you hear some of the people in the film saying the same thing about here
Mhm.
in
Mhm.
California. But the then the constant neglect from the government to support any kind of like they were saying the AIDS war and the demonization of whole community.
Mhm. Mhm.
They were saying that, of course, me being Latino, I thought that this was my punishment, for loving another man. So
Sure.
I had already I drank the Kool-Aid. I mean, this is this is what was expected to happen.
And there's so much guilt and shame that comes with that perspective, right? That really is inhibitory for you to be, or anybody to be, their full self. Um,
Yeah. So I like I said, I had my own cocoon. I had my own little silo, and I don't remember going to AIDS-related funeral or memorial till the early '90s. I
mhm.
mean, that's how isolated I placed myself in. And watching the film and seeing all my peers were long gone, and that's why I label some of them, because their names shouldn't be forgotten, because they're the ones that put their lives on the line, just like Connie did.
Mhm. Mhm.
Connie wasn't the only one. I mean, but those other souls, those other peers, those other friends and lovers need to be remembered for what they went through, especially in the first years of which was horrible deaths, ravaging deaths. I think
Mhm.
even the general population had no idea unless they had somebody that they had to take care of, or
Right.
some of the general population rejected them. They didn't want to have anything to do with them. So this is a reminder that that kind of pandemic can happen at any time, like we're going through right now.
Mhm.
And I think it's only because it's affected more of the general population that we paid so much attention to it. Back then, it was only the age, the homosexual, the homophiliacs, and the Haitians who are getting it.
Right.
If I don't know anybody from that category, then I'm okay. And as we know, AIDS is not over. I mean, they're still raging in other parts of the world,
Mhm.
and a lot of my friends who live with, taking the medication for years now,
Yeah.
25, 30 years. So it's by no means over. And I think the film reminds people that we need to continue to be militant and vigilant, and not to rest on our laurels, because at any time things just can turn around like that.
No, no, absolutely. It made me sad watching the film and remembering that she had passed away of AIDS complications in 1996, which is right around the time when the good medications became available. And she, it's sad that she just kind of missed that window of effective treatments that, may have saved her life, and extended her life anyway, at the moment. And yeah, and I think your point earlier in the film brings us up at the end that, we all stand on the shoulders of our predecessors, right? And I'm a scientist by training, when I was in graduate school, that was always something that my graduate mentor would say, like, you're making advances in your own scientific research, but you're really standing on a wealth of incredible knowledge that your predecessors have developed. And I think it's the same situation when you consider like political and activist movements that, and I'm sure for younger LGBTQ individuals, it's easy for all of us to forget that the struggles back then for most of us as part of the LGBTQ community were really quite different than they are now. And I think your film really shows in a realistic way, again, with that footage that you were able to pull in and procure, really shows the intensity of people of that time to just get their voices heard, let alone get any policy or legislation that's going to help. But even their voices were being ignored. And so they had to scream loud. And I think Connie had to be loud with her personality. And as you said, otherwise you would just be forgotten that much more.
Yeah, and also rightfully angry.
Mhm.
When she got angry, was rightful. It wasn't just to be angry and and be the angry trans woman in the room. She was rightfully angry,
Mhm.
and she believed in radical resistance.
Right.
And I think that what's important to point out to the general public, and I'm glad that it's showing it at Bend, because this is one of our third or fourth um, mainstream, I call it non-LGBTQ film festival that we're showing the film. And I think because we all come from families, not everybody in our family is LGBTQ. I'm the only one in a huge Latino family.
Mhm.
And these are the audiences that we hope to engage. And I hope that they learn that the struggles that as us as LGBTQ people went through the AIDS pandemic, it comes from struggles of social movement that came from before, the women's movement, the civil rights
Mhm.
movement, and the Liberation Front, and continues with Black Lives Matter. I mean, it's unfortunately, at least in the United States, we have to continue to fight, to speak up, to go into the streets. That's why I started the film with that chant, because
Mhm.
we have to take to the streets, especially now that we're facing with a lot of anti-trans, what I call them anti-violence, because all those legislations that are trying to curtail parents from giving their trans kids, their medications or their care or playing sports is violence. I mean, I know from working on my earlier film that girl, every time she was bullied at school or told her that, no, be in the boys' side or you have to dress, it was really violent to her mind and to her soul, and that really, if you start hearing that from the time you're 4 or 5 years old, I mean, just can imagine what kind of damage it does. And it takes
Absolutely.
years and years, if ever, that
Mhm.
you can live happily in your authentic skin, like Harry Hay was talking about way back then.
Right.
So I think for our allies and the families, I always tell my friends from Peru, I said, like, because they don't know anybody LGBTQ except me, which is bullshit. If people are just too afraid to come out to them. And when I bring out my trans friends to our restaurants and dinners and reunions, they're like, they feel, oh my God, this is the first trans person I ever met. So I just can imagine the kind of impact that Connie made on all those people back then,
Absolutely.
in the middle of the struggle, in the middle of the carnage, in the middle of the genocide. Connie was the beacon of light that there could be a better future for everybody, not just the trans community, but everybody who came to meet her. So that's my biggest hope, and I'm glad that you know people in Oregon and elsewhere will get to see the film and reflect on the privilege that they have. I
Mhm.
reflect on my privileges. I'm sure you do too, Jamie,
No, absolutely.
when you watch that struggle, not only Connie's struggle, but of her friends. And also remember there were, like Valerie Spencer says in the film, trans women have nowhere to go back then, you
Mhm.
know.
Mhm. Exactly.
Latino men like me who came out and still are very stigmatized. I
Mhm.
mean, I have Latino friends my age who haven't told their families
Mm.
yet that they're
Mhm.
HIV positive. You
Right.
know, or they're waiting for their parents to die before they can come out, you
Right.
know, because the
Right.
stigma still there, is very much there.
No, it very much is, and that's it's amazingly unfortunate, and it does prevent us from living our true selves in many situations and in many various social situations. I think one thing the film does really well, and I think this is a great reason for one of the many reasons for people to view the film, is all of your footage of ACT UP and the struggles to really fight HIV/AIDS and government healthcare policies and all of that. At the end of the film, you kind of briefly touched on this. You have images of more current Black Lives Matter struggles, women rights struggles, and it's juxtaposed in such a way that's like, wow, you know, we've made so much progress on so many fronts, in many different, you know, socio-political realms and worlds, but we are far from near to where things need to end, right? I mean, marginalized individuals, the fight and the advocacy needs to continue, because even though what we're seeing in the film from the early 90s, late 80s, it's so similar to many of the same struggles that are happening now. And I think the film really captures that towards the end, when you have those images of the more, like I said, the more contemporary movements that are occurring. So I really appreciated that tremendously. You know, one thing that Connie, you showed in the film that Connie mentioned was about transgender and the link to sort of the more indigenous cultures and the two spirit, and that there's gender fluidity in those indigenous cultures. And you know, we hear a lot of that now, in many of the conversations, which I love. But you know, her statements on this, again, we're back in like 1990 or 1991. I'd love to know if you could comment on that, because I was like, wow, this, talk about a visionary in many ways. It was quite moving, actually.
Well, it was very intentional of me. If you see my past work, is been highlighting trans lives, mostly trans activist lives.
Mhm.
And when I found that footage, which was very rough, we had to work a lot on to make it look, you know, possible and available to put in the film. But it really showed that that Connie has opened up her mind from the just living in the Western mindset of what gender is, and open herself up to the Eastern and other cultures who have always revered third gender, and also spending all that time with the Mahus in Kauai,
Mhm.
and just reading, like I said before, um, and finding out that she was more leaning in her development, in her gender journey, like I call, into that construct, you know,
Mhm.
and it is a social construct. And I think if you read any kind of Eastern philosophy, you'll find that that's what it is,
Mhm.
you know.
Mhm.
And that's why she has that beautiful statement at the end of that speech when she talks about trying to reach her humanity,
Right.
you know, uh, without oppression and self-hatred.
Exactly.
That's what she was striving for, and that's what she hopes. That's her really her message for the for us, for the future, not only for the trans community, for anybody who has struggling with finding their place in this world and being
Mhm.
visible. Is That's what it is. It's all about our finding our
Our
humanity and
humanity.
yeah. And
Absolutely.
that
No.
always, you know, that always, it like gives me goosebumps because it's all, I mean, it relates to anybody, you know. I think we all doing that, and if we're not, then
I think we all need, I think we all do need to do that, but we need to pause in order to do that, I feel sometimes, and not be so reactive. Just like you're right, we all are on this planet, and we should be striving to really embrace our humanity, um, with everything. Absolutely. Uh, what would you like your viewers to take away from the film?
Well, I mean, I just take it from Connie's, interview with Sheila Kuehl at the end, when she just tells you to be yourself, you know, but also to think about others. She was a bridge builder. She could talk to anybody from the Wally Georges of her time
Mm-hmm.
to the trans Mahus from Kauai. I mean, what we're seeing right now is totally the opposite of what Connie was advocating for,
Mm-hmm.
the division and the hatred. And I think that the biggest takeaway for people to see is that we have been in this situation before.
Mm-hmm.
We have been through a pandemic. We came out the other way. We all took medications. Now we're all getting vaccinated because we started thinking about not just what's good for me, but for my neighbor,
Mm-hmm.
my family,
Mm-hmm.
the kids, my grandparents, and yeah, and just allowed everybody the love and empathy that you would want for yourself,
Mm-hmm.
you know.
No, no, absolutely, and very well stated, Duarte. Absolutely. Um, Great. Okay, so I am speaking to Duarte
Dante,
Alencastra.
Dante.
Dante, sorry. I am so sorry. Dante Alencastra, a filmmaker whose documentary film, will be showing at the Bend Film Festival next week, called AIDS Diva, the life story of Connie Newman and
Norman.
Norman. So sorry. God, my eyes are horrible. And I highly recommend everybody watching this film. If you have any last minute comments, we'd be welcome to hear them.
Well, the only thing I'm gonna say, like I said before, I wish I was there in person. I would have loved to. I'm sure we are gonna have a very meaningful conversation and a very mindful conversation with the audience, which I guess we'll leave it for next year.
Mhm.
But you can follow us for any questions, any information at AIDS Diva, and I'm sure the festival, Salim and would definitely let you know if they want to bring it to their communities, bring it to the colleges, bring it to the campuses. I think it's a conversation started, intergenerational and beyond. And let's all get educated and get on the path of being compassionate with each other and learning from each other. So thank you so much for viewing the film. And thank you, Jamie, for the insightful questions.
Yeah, no, absolutely, Dante. I really appreciate it, and like I said, I really enjoyed the film. I feel lucky to have had a chance to as a sneak preview prior to the interview. So I definitely will be telling everybody to make sure not to watch it. It's not super long. It's just a little bit over an hour,
Right.
but there's a lot of amazing footage and stories of humanity and realness throughout it. You get pulled in right from the get-go of the film, which is really
Yeah.
fantastic. Um,
You,
Great.
you'll wind up inspired and you want to go to the streets and, you know, and act up and fight back.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yes.
No, that is very
And,
true. That is
and,
very true,
and
which
get
is
in some
which
really good trouble.
and it's the timing is perfect because I think we all need that right now, just as Connie did back then. So
Yeah.
bravo.
Yeah.
Great.
Thank you, Jamie.
Yep. No, thank you.